Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael Nixon, Senior Director of Product Marketing with Snowflake, and I'm here with our Solution Engineer, Rob Silva.
Hey,
Great, good to hear you, Rob. I'd like to welcome everyone to our session today in which we're going to talk about Nirvana, from Netezza to Nirvana. So what we have queued up for you is some information about Snowflake, our technology, our architecture, a little bit about us, and how if you're coming from a Netezza environment, you'll just be blown away with Snowflake. Now, let's start by setting the stage here. We know that many of you, if you are currently a Netezza user, you have an uncertain future for your platform. As we all know, the platform has been slated to have end of support very soon, and if not end of support, it's already on end of marketing. So the question is, what do you do from here? And with Snowflake, we believe that if you love the purpose-built of analytics on Netezza, you're really going to be blown away by the technology that we have with Snowflake, because we're a technology that's built for the cloud, and we provide you a number of different, or I would say, advantages in moving to the cloud that you'll have over and beyond the great things that you love with Netezza. So before getting started, we like to break the ice a little bit and ask questions of you as to where you are with your current Netezza implementation. So we have a question queued up, which I'd like for you to just take a few moments to go through, and the question is, what of the following best describes you? You're considering an alternative to your TwinFin or your N1000X system. You're considering an alternative to your Striper system, N2000X system, or maybe an alternative to your Mako system. Maybe you have all of these systems and you're obviously planning to move ahead and looking for alternatives. Or if you're not a Netezza user and you're just interested in the topic and you're logging in, let us know. So take a few moments to answer those questions, and then we'll show the results. So again, we're happy to have you here today. We have a number of discussions queued up to review Snowflake and our technology and areas of which we believe that you'll find exciting from a scalability perspective, from a concurrency perspective, and we just can't wait to share those facts with you. So we're going to now take a look and see the survey results, and it appears that we have a few of you who are on TwinFin, and you can see the result for yourself, some on Mako, and you have multiple alternatives. No one on Striper. Really interesting. And some of you are just listening in. So great. So thank you for answering that question. It helps us to set the stage a little bit. So now let's move on. So about Snowflake. If you don't know about Snowflake already, we were founded in 2012 by a couple of database veterans, both of whom have PhDs, and between them they have 80 patents. And they brought on a third member to help found the company. And they basically believe that the way in 2012 the industry was looking at handling big data wasn't the most effective way from a future-looking cloud perspective, and they just simply believed that there was a better way, and they went about the business of creating the architecture. We had our first customers in 2014, which would have been our preview customers, and then our general availability was in 2015 when we first formally launched the Snowflake product. Now, since then, we've grown to well over 1,000 customers, and we continue to grow quite rapidly. And if you're monitoring the startup market, or the IPO market, if you will, the funding for Snowflake has now reached the mark of $470 million and above, and our valuation currently is at about $1.5 billion. So that's a little bit about us and Snowflake, and so now I'd like to dive down a little bit more about what makes us different. From the very beginning, Snowflake was a purpose-built architecture designed for the cloud. And what I mean by that is that we're not an on-premises technology that's been ported to the cloud. We're not the usual distributed technology that you might find with Hadoop by way of HDFS and other MPP distributed architectures. Now, we implement some levels of MPP, and I'll discuss that with Rob when we get to the architecture, but we're an all-new database cloud architecture, and from scratch. We built Snowflake to operate on cloud infrastructure, in particular AWS as of today, and in the future will be on other cloud architectures. And what that means is that we really take advantage of the availability, the reliability, and most principally the virtually unlimited amount of resources that you can have for both storage and compute capacity. And so with Snowflake, you can achieve virtually unlimited concurrency. You can have elastic scalability where you can take up your compute or you can take down your compute, you can grow your storage. But not only can you elastically scale, you can do it independently. So therefore, you're not tied to storage, or if you want to just grow compute, or vice versa, you're not tied to compute when you just want to grow storage. And we're a software-driven service, and what that means here is that everything with Snowflake is done by our software, and it's automated management delivered as a service. So behind the scenes, we don't have what you might think in terms of a managed service environment where we're managing the architecture on your behalf. No, in this case, it's all driven by software. So we don't have technical personnel that's just managing a system like perhaps some sort of what we'll say is a service or outsourcing operation. That's not what Snowflake is. It's all driven by the architecture. So now I'd like to get into about what distinguishes Snowflake and what makes us different, and why, as a Netezza user, you'll be very enamored with our technology. And so at this point, I would like to ask Rob to let's walk through the architecture a little bit, and from a Netezza perspective, maybe highlight some of the key points that you'll find very attractive with Snowflake.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So this picture here is probably my favorite picture that kind of outlines the architecture of Snowflake, because to that end user, to that person that's running the query, they see Snowflake as just an IP, or not even an IP address, just a URL. And behind the scenes, just like with a Netezza appliance, there's been a tremendous amount of engineering that's gone into this to make it simple, to make it look like any other database. But when you start to peel back the layers and gain a better understanding of some of that engineering and some of those technical differentiators, you realize that we're really not just any other database. We're, as Michael pointed out, a cloud-native data warehouse that's really built differently. And that's because of some of these concepts that have always existed for as long as Snowflake existed. So starting from the ground up, our product is built on top of blob storage. So whether it's S3, eventually Azure Files, that's an infinitely scalable resource. And if you think about traditional architectures and legacy databases, they've had to work within the constraints that the physical implementation of storage has always presented. So to go back to that and say, okay, well, if you remove that, what does that do to your product? Well, there's a lot of engineering that would have to go into, a legacy architecture to allow that to now fully leverage this new way of storing data. Just above that is our compute layer. So think of this, each one of these compute boxes that you've got there, those are a dedicated cluster to a particular workload. And it's almost synonymous, if you think about your Netezza systems, it's almost synonymous with the blade center chassis that you have in each of those boxes. It's just compute. There's no persistent storage there. There's no advanced knowledge of what the optimizer is going to ask it to do. And there's really no advanced knowledge of what disks it may be operating on. But unlike an Netezza appliance, imagine if you could take your Netezza appliance and rip out the storage and rip out the hosts and have those compute engines be connected to all of the different databases that you might have in your environment. Each one of these, while independent in terms of compute, have complete visibility to all the data that's on that that unified storage layer, which in this case, in the context of AWS, we'll call it S3. So any one of these, the one on the left, there's the 4 dark boxes. That's a 4-node cluster that's dedicated to just your BI users. They're going in, they're querying data. They're sized specifically to meet performance demands and SLAs of that workload. To your far right, you've got a different compute engine that's only 2 nodes. That might be for your ETL and data integration activities. The 2 of these activities now are interacting with the exact same data, same storage layer, but they now have dedicated compute, so they never interact with they never interfere with each other and introduce, concurrency, performance problems as a result of the concurrency, because they're not competing for the same resources. So now it's like each one of your workloads, each one of your applications, and really however you architect it, have their own dedicated Netezza system, MPP cluster. In this case, it's a 4-node and a 2-node cluster that their queries run on. And because, again, we're born in the cloud, and the concept of elastic scalability has always existed, these warehouses can be as temporary or as permanent as you want. You can grow them vertically immediately. You can grow them horizontally. There's really no limit to what you can do in terms of compute, and it all happens on the fly and instantly. And then above this layer, this is where, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that was good. Go ahead, Rob.
Yep. Oh, I should actually point out, on the topic of concurrency, another great feature, and again, when you're built with these, awesome concepts in mind and all these constraints that you've always operated within are eliminated, now you start to see what's possible. So we took this compute warehouse and said, hey, it's great that it's all isolated, we can eliminate concurrency, but how do we solve the problem of scalability? In other words, in my business, there are days of the week, months of the year, weeks of the year, whatever, where the demand is going to be greater. And I don't want to have to size these things specifically to address that peak and then have this underutilized asset. Actually, if it's an underutilized asset, it's really an expense on my book. So what can I do there? So what Snowflake has done is they've developed this concept of a multi-cluster warehouse. And what that does is in this case, with the BI workload to the far left, we're looking at the incoming query volume. We're a 4-node cluster. We're hitting performance SLAs easily, typical days. But then that day the quarter comes, it's quarter end, and suddenly we're flooded with 3, 4, 5x the typical query activity. And it's those situations, especially with a physical appliance, that performance really suffers unless you've made the investment and overbought. With Snowflake, what we do is we recognize that there's an unusually large number of queries. We recognize that performance is eventually going to slip and things are going to start to queue. But rather than let it get to that point, we instantiate another 4-node cluster and load balance those queries across it. And then if the volume of queries continue to grow, we instantiate yet another 4-node cluster and load balance the queries across it. And the size of the cluster and the upper limit of the number of clusters that you want instantiated are all completely controlled by you. And it now gives you the operational flexibility to define how many clusters am I willing to spin up to meet the query demand? And at what point do I no longer want to do that? And then just as quickly as the query volumes return back to normal, those clusters are returned back to the available pool. They're completely suspended, and you don't incur any costs for those compute resources at that point because you're no longer using them.
That's great. So that's a great overview. So let's continue and talk a little bit about the built-in cloud services, and I'd like to emphasize that, and I want to hold that thought regarding the other components you were just mentioning. So, for example, with the built-in services, we include the security, we include the disaster recovery and high availability, and also these things are all built in without you having to do any provisioning of the technology. Say, for example, you can have up to 24 hours minimum of data retention, but that can be scaled to up to 90 days, depending on the Snowflake package that you choose. And then also the secret to the Snowflake environment really is our metadata. And with our metadata, we're tracking everything from the data that you load to the query that you're launching to the tables that are created. So therefore, we're able to orchestrate all the activities with respect to the operation that Rob was speaking about with regard to all the different workflows. So just in summary, you can scale up the storage, you can scale down the compute nodes, and then even within individual compute nodes, you can or the compute engines, you can grow the size of that engine to the size that you require and basically customize everything to your specific operation. And that's one of the more attractive features about Snowflake. So now let's talk more about the underlying database architecture. It's all ANSI SQL. It's all ANSI SQL. So coming from a Netezza environment, you'll have the robust ANSI SQL capabilities you would expect, including support for multi-statement transactions, and also you will have a large number of functions that are already built in. Now, I spoke a little bit about the automated management that's included with the Snowflake environment, so let's detail what that means. So as already highlighted by Rob, no infrastructure for which you have to manage, no tuning, no optimization, no indexing, no storage worries, no vacuuming, no partitioning, very similar to your Netezza environment, which was pretty much a hands-off appliance. And so you get that experience and more with Snowflake. And so it's all delivered as a software-driven service. And then in addition, we can support all of your data. So let's talk about what that means. So you can have structured data, you can have semi-structured data. That semi-structured data can be XML, JSON, Avro, ORC, and what have you. And all of that can be combined into Snowflake. And how that works is that we have what we refer to as our variant data type. And with our variant data type, you are able to ingest the JSON, or let's call it ingest the semi-structured data, and Snowflake will automatically columnarize that data so that you can begin querying it almost immediately. So without a lot of effort for you to do data preparation or the types of things that you would normally have to do, for example, transforming it in advance, that all goes away with Snowflake. You can natively ingest using one of the tools that we partner with, say, for example, Informatica or Fivetran or Matillion or any number of the data replication vendors out there for which you can replicate for your production environment and bring the data into Snowflake. And with that, you get a fully governed, secure, cloud-built data warehouse. That's, as I said, ANSI SQL, and as well, you can support data access through Python, R, as well as we have native Spark integration. So if you have a Spark cluster on the side, for example, in the cloud, and you want to be able to push down queries for faster operations into our data warehouse, you'll be able to do that with our Spark connector. However, one of the biggest advantages of which I was alluded to by Rob is you have a single source of truth now. And by a single source of truth, what we mean is that regardless of the number of work groups, and we'll have a graphic to demonstrate that in just a few moments, regardless of the number of work groups that you have deployed in Snowflake, they all have a single authority for that data, so you don't have to worry about synchronization or consistency. That's all built in via the Snowflake architecture. So naturally, as you would expect, you can use the SQL tools, the BI tools, and the popular visualization tools that you currently have available through your environment. So let's talk a little bit about the concurrency and supporting all your users, of which Snowflake allows you to do. So you can have a work group that's dedicated, or we'll call it a compute engine dedicated to data loading. You can have a compute engine dedicated to running executive dashboards. And then you can have another compute cluster, maybe a much larger one that's focused on data science. And then you can also support the test dev environment. So unlike what you have with your Netezza environment, we provide you the ability to do zero-copy cloning. So what that means is, regardless of the size of your database, it could be a terabyte, 10 terabytes, or 500 gigabytes, what have you, you can set up a new database and copy an existing database simply by creating that database. And there's no data movement. It's very similar to what you may be familiar with, which is logical snapshots, and all of that is orchestrated by Snowflake, and then that test dev environment can run off and do its own thing and run analytics. So let's now map out a timeline. So let's just take a timeline that it's a typical 24-hour cycle. You can have one warehouse that's dedicated to doing the batch processing early in the morning between 3 and 6 a.m., for example. When the workers or when your BI users or your executives come into the office, they all get onto their own separate data warehouse, and now they're running the queries, they're running the dashboards. So nothing out of the normal here you would expect. So, for example, you queued up a batch pipeline early in the morning. When that's done, now you're running your users. So you might think, well, what's special about that? Because you can just basically queue these activities with a single cluster environment like Netezza. The difference here is that these are individual compute engines, hence the color coding. So you can have yet another work group on a larger cluster running data science. Now, what's the beauty of Snowflake and the concurrency which Rob was highlighting, let's say later in the afternoon, you can have the data science team bringing up their compute engine along with the BI users, and there's some overlapping time. But guess what? They all have access to the data, and there's no issue with dirty reads or lack of integrity. And all along, you could be loading in new data using a smaller cluster, for example, for streaming in new JSON data or new structured data or whatever the case may be. So this is a way of visualizing how you can handle concurrency with the Snowflake environment. So the net of this, and the bottom line value is you customize for your business needs, and there's no struggle or contention for resources. So another outstanding feature for Snowflake that you will not be able to achieve with the Netezza environment is what we refer to as live data sharing. So we all are certainly familiar with wanting to run internal reports or doing dashboards, or maybe you're more focused on predictive analytics and you're doing data science along those lines. But even beyond that, now you might want to think about how you want to build an economy around your data. So think in terms of being able to extend your Snowflake data warehouse. So you have internal users that are operating with you on your existing Snowflake warehouse, but maybe you have, we'll say, corporate divisions or other business units that are outside of your data warehouse and they need to use or share your data. Well, with Snowflake, you can extend your data to them by way of our live data sharing. And all that is required is that your business partners or your line of business units or what have you can have their own Snowflake instance of which they can now sync up together and effectively speaking, share data from your warehouse into their environment without ever moving data. And this saves you enormous amount of time, labor, and resources in terms of sharing data. And you can go even further and go external. So perhaps you want to build value on top of your data and reach out to a group of consumers, data consumers, and be able to commercialize your data. So again, with Snowflake, you can extend to external data partners, and your ambitions can be even broader, whereby you may have some adjacent market opportunities for your data, and you can envision expanding the network of your data to even broader use cases. So this is what we mean by the Snowflake live data sharing. And with live data sharing, it's up to date. As soon as the data is committed to a transaction or to a table, or however you'd like to view it, that everyone that has been granted access to share that data will see that data immediately. Again, no movement of data, no struggles to use FTP or any other file sharing or data sharing type of technology that generally encounters a lot of burden from a sharing perspective. So extend the reach of your data and build more potential and value add for your data environment. So lastly, we have what we will refer to as true consumption-based pricing. So there's not the concept of a license with Snowflake. You pay only for the resources that you use. And so what we have here is a chart. And imagine with this chart what you you're able to have different levels of usage throughout the day. And Rob alluded to this in terms of perhaps you have peak demand, you're a retailer, and it's later in the year, and you're in your holiday cycle or what have you, and you have a need to size up your system. So with Snowflake, what you're able to do is avoid what this red line shows, is that if you know in advance, for example, you're going to have a peak period with a typical type of on-premises environment, and what I mean here is something like Netezza, you normally would have to size up in advance. You would have to bring in a new rack or talk about building up that environment ahead of when that demand peak hits. But that's not the concept with Snowflake. You bring the environment that you require at the time that you need it, and then our pricing tracks right along with it. So what that translates into is that you're able to pay only for what you use without over-provisioning. You can eliminate overbuy, which basically means you're paying, you can eliminate that premium of having to buy hardware in advance of scaling. And then more powerfully, when there's no idle time or where there's no compute time being consumed, or in other words, the system is idle, then there are no charges. That's what we mean by no charge for idle compute time. Now, all you need to do then is size up your system and create a larger data warehouse, or maybe bring on board a new warehouse, and that is all you need to do in order to scale. So that's an overview of the Snowflake elasticity. And so with that, I'd like to now perhaps ask another poll question, which is, what are your plans for your analytic workloads? What are you thinking today as it relates to perhaps moving workloads to the cloud? And the options are, you believe cloud is strategic to your environment, so you're evaluating the best plans, or you don't really have a strategic direction, but you're considering both on-premises plan and cloud options, or perhaps you're just not too keen on moving to the cloud at all. So let us know your current thoughts as to your thinking with relation to the cloud technology. So as you're answering that, so I'd like to ask you, Rob, from your experience in working with many customers, what have you found to be one of the more attractive things that, or features that Snowflake makes possible for customers moving to the cloud? Perhaps you can talk to a couple of examples.
Sure. So the multi-clustering is a big one, because I think unexpected concurrency, how you deal with that is very different with this architecture. You can simply add more compute, add another resource. It's all dynamic. That's great. Another one, and it's going to be a bold statement, but I look at Snowflake as being as simple to Netezza as what Netezza was to the technologies it was competing with when it was first brought to market 15 years ago. We've moved the needle even further. So the things that Netezza simplified around delivering it as appliance, standing it up quickly, making it load ready, absolutely nailed that, and nobody could compete with them. But there were still things you had to do, like there's still data tuning. It wasn't performance or query optimizations, but you had to tune the data. You had to distribute the data a certain way. When they introduced partitioning, you had to, or not partitioning, cluster-based tables, you had to organize the table and groom the tables. And then, of course, you had to back up the data, and, all those things drew compute away from the appliance. If you think about how long a backup of a massive environment took, it was significant. All of those things now, those fall onto that no slide that you showed up. It's no longer about worrying about how to distribute the data to co-locate it with the other disk. There's no more grooming. There's no backup. I mean, backup for some of the customers that we worked with, that was an operation that could consume the vast majority of a weekend day to do the fulls, and then an hour or two for incrementals over the course of the week. When you return all that compute back to the customer, or back to the users, they see that. And when you eliminate it altogether and you simplify the operations associated with the warehouse, that frees up that technical staff to work on higher value operations and to deliver, on projects that are looking to gain even deeper insights from the data that you're collecting and capture more. So I really think that as simple and easy to use as Netezza was, we're that dramatic of a shift to the right in terms of even easier and more simple to use.
Great. Thank you for those insights. I appreciate the actual example. So here we have our responses with regards to your plans for analytic workloads moving to the cloud. So nearly 60% of you have a strategic objective for your organization to move to the cloud, whereas 30% of you are not strategic, but it's not a strategic objective, but you're considering on-premises and cloud options, and then the remaining 10% not too keen on the cloud. So a vast majority looking at cloud by a major portion here. And by the way, I want to mention that we have live Q&A. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, by all means, please ask those questions. And we already have one in. The question is, well, what are the storage costs, say, for a petabyte of raw data? Well, let's just say the storage cost for Snowflake is based on the storage infrastructure. And in our case, with the Amazon AWS implementation, you paid the S3 pricing, which translates to roughly $23 per terabyte compressed per month. And we don't require you to have to use premium storage to achieve the fastest performance. You can maintain your S3 type of storage service, and that pricing will vary naturally depending what region in the world you are. So the U.S. region price will be different than Europe, will be different than Asia Pacific, but for all of the U.S., you're paying $23 per terabyte per month, and that's compressed. So if you do the math to figure out what a petabyte would cost, just multiply that by 1,000. So the storage costs are very, very affordable. So we just had a question come in. When will this be available on Azure? Well, I can't officially announce anything today, so I would invite you to stay tuned about news with regards to Snowflake and Azure. I believe you'll be very happy with some pending announcements that we'll have coming fairly soon from Snowflake. So let's move on, and I'll be listening for your questions and want to certainly hear them if you have them. So let's review one of our more successful implementations from an Netezza environment, and this would be with OnDeck Financial Services. You may have heard of them, and they are currently using Snowflake to help drive their infrastructure, which, from their business perspective, executes real-time analytics and they help small businesses to gain access to capital. They have, yes. Okay, so we have over, with OnDeck, they are supporting over 80,000 small business users, and they were having a struggle with the MPP scaling, and by this, that meant with the rapid rate of growth, it was difficult to scale up their environment. So they had challenges with managing distribution keys, data skew was getting out of control, and integration with semi-structured data was very difficult. And so from this, it was very difficult to support multiple environments. So they were looking for a new way of doing things. And so they come to Snowflake, and with Snowflake, we were able to help them elastically grow their infrastructure, meaning that the infrastructure now tracks with their actual business. And when they need to, say, grow dramatically at the holiday period where things could really take off for small businesses, then they could bring on resources with Snowflake with no problem. And therefore, they were able to aggregate all their users onto a single platform. And by this, I mean they didn't have to have a separate environment for their business analysts or their BI users versus their data scientist teams. They could combine it all on one single platform. And also with this, they were able to implement their robust security, all of which is built into Snowflake. And then with this, they were able to eliminate the burden of supporting separate teams, because with one environment, they can now operate from a common database, data warehouse perspective. All right? We have another question. Is the cost? All right, so here's an interesting question. So is the cost effective if all query consumption on-prem and there's a lot of data movement from the cloud? Well, I think this kind of depends. If I'm reading in between the lines, what you're basically asking with this question is, how does the cost of computing in the cloud compare with the cost of computing on premises, especially if you have to move data to the cloud? So this obviously gets down to the heart of the matter of total cost of ownership, and the total cost of ownership definitely will include the cost of moving data to the cloud plus the cost of query. But more than just the absolute cost of moving data and running queries, you need to also think about the environments that you're able to save. Say, for example, you don't have to run multiple clusters, or you don't have to have multiple licenses. You don't have to incur the cost of support on multiple clusters. And then there's just a whole cost efficiency advantages of being able to directly map your compute with the actual needs of the business. So by not having to size up front, you're basically able to save on cost by eliminating not just the hardware acquisition, which obviously is the case when you move to the cloud, but the operational side as well, meaning you're not operating a system that where there's no compute demand. So by most of our cost savings that you will see through Snowflake is by having that level of cost efficiency, which is you tie the actual cost of the service to the actual needs of your query environment, and that's where you'll be able to see some cost savings. Now, as you use Snowflake, you will definitely see an increase in charges. Why? Because you're using it more. And a number of our customers have expressed the benefit of knowing that their costs actually track with actual usage, and that's a very attractive thing. Let's see. All right, so what else do we have? So there was a question about cost savings with OnDeck. I can't speak to that directly. Rob, I'm going to sort of bounce this to you a little bit based on your experience in working with customers so far. Are there other things you can say with regards to cost of operation in comparison with existing Netezza environment? Are there some things you'd like to add to that?
Sure. So in just my general experience, with Netezza customers, generally speaking, they have a lot of storage capacity. You have to buy a much bigger box for compute than for the actual storage. Like, you just don't size those systems that way. So when you look at the amount of unused storage that, there's still devices that are in a data center that still have to be maintained, the firmware, there's still failure rates. I mean, there's a lot of gear to get to the compute. So the savings is that you now provision each completely independent of each other. You no longer buy, this one physical box that has, enough of all of the resources that you have. When all you need is compute, you provision the compute that you need for as little time as you need. The storage is completely elastic as well. You provision that completely separately. So they're just not tied together anymore. In terms of cost savings, I mean, if you look at what the cost, if it were truly just a storage question, an Netezza appliance is a pretty expensive box. The maintenance and SNS that goes on top of that, obviously, is another expense to consider. S3 blob storage at $20-something per month. Compressed, and our compression rate is something like 4 to 5x. So you're getting like 4 to 5 terabytes of data packed into 1 terabyte of blob storage. It's pretty significant savings when all things considered.
Fantastic. All right, so we have a few other questions, and this is great, and we love seeing this, and this is the part of the discussion in which we were wanting to take your questions, actually, so all of you are already piping in, so we love seeing this. Now, let's take a few more of your questions. I have a question here that says, how do we compare to other platforms, data warehouse platforms that are running in the cloud. Yeah, let's handle that, because the Snowflake environment is dramatically different than most other data warehouses that you'll see in the cloud, and they're different. We're different because, for example, with the elastic capability that we spoke about, you only bring in the compute resources as required. So therefore, if you have idle compute time, and we didn't call this out very specifically, but with the Snowflake environment, you have what we refer to as our suspend mode. And you can auto-suspend a running cluster if it's idle, say, for example, for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever the case may be. We give you a couple of markers to establish. And once it hits suspend, guess what? The system is in a sleep state, if you will. You don't need to re-provision it when a new query comes in and it hits that cluster. It'll wake up itself and then it will operate. And so what this means is that you're only running the operation or the compute engine when necessary. Compared to other architectures that are in the cloud, they do not have that elastic capability. They may say they scale. However, what happens is that you have to take the system down in terms of it being disrupted. So it might be available for read-only, but new writes are not available, and there's also the risk that the system could go down completely. So that's disrupted. So you can have a disrupted environment as you scale. Now, to avoid that sort of thing, usually what will happen is that these data warehouses will run operationally 24/7, so as a result, your meter is running during that time. So that is where we see some advantages of Snowflake relative to other data architectures in the cloud. And that is, again, elastic operation. You only use the compute services when needed, whereas with these other data warehouses, they have to run 24/7. Now, in addition to that, running 24/7, they're not a true delivered service. And what I mean by that is, as I emphasized early on at the start of this webinar, our software manages everything for you. Now, naturally, if you run into an issue in your environment, you're going to call our support to have that issue resolved. But in normal case operation, our software is managing everything. So when you need a provision, our software is doing that for you. You need to expand into a multi-cluster environment, our software is doing that for you. That's not the case for these other data warehouses. You have to manage the data warehouse. You have to manage distribution keys. Say, for example, if compute is tied to storage, so if you want to grow storage, you have to grow your compute environment, and you encounter those disruptions along with the manageability concerns. So the distribution keys have to be managed. The database tuning has to be managed. The optimization of the queries have to be managed. All of that is done independently by our software and automatically for you. So that's a series of things, but that's what makes us different in how we compare to other architectures in the cloud. So let's see if we have any more questions. Your questions are slowing down, and I want to encourage you to ask a few more if you are interested. So at this time, we like to make it a wrap if there are no other questions, and I'd like to remind you that despite what we may say, it's really easy to get started with Snowflake. You just go out to snowflake.net, click on Try for Free, and you can begin testing for yourself and see how easy Snowflake is to use. Or you can work with a Snowflake representative who will orchestrate getting a POC set up for you, and we can take it from there in terms of testing out Snowflake. So if there are no other questions, are there closing remarks you'd like to make, Rob, before we call it a wrap?
No, that's it for me. If there are no other questions, it's been great.
Great. So, all right. So I want to once again thank everyone for taking time out of your schedules. We know everyone is busy. We were happy that you were able to join us for 45 minutes, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again in the future with Snowflake. So thank you.